Hello everyone, how are y'all doing? Doing good? Yeah, we made it to the end of the first day. I know a lot of people here have been here since 8 a.m. when before it was raining, then it started to pour, now it's raining again, and we just kind of went through the whole cycle. So thank you all for sticking around, and for those of you who are here for your first event, welcome. I just want to, I don't want to say a lot, so I do want to make sure that we have, time for this keynote to wrap up day one of our conference. And, it's a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Karma Chavez, who is a great scholar who you can read more about in the program, but has published a multitude of books on trans and queer migrations, AIDS, Palestine, which will be one of the topics for today's keynote. And the one really quick thing I just want to say before handing the mic over to Dr. Chavez is when we're sort of forming the conference and imagining it back in, was that the summer? I want to say very early on, we're kind of talking about who the keynote speaker should be. And I know for me, the first person that came to mind was Dr. Chavez, the #1 pick in my mind. So when I sent the email and got a very positive message that Dr. Chavez could be here, I was super excited. And so without further ado, let's give a big Crest TCU round of applause to Dr. Chavez.
So maybe we'll just sit up here together. How's that sound? Does that work for y'all?
That's perfect.
Listen together. Oh, good. I can see everyone. All right. Excellent. So I'm a bag lady. You're out of bag, so. So, thank you for having me. Louise, Stacy, Lisa, I don't know, Lisa with everyone else who's involved with Crest and who made it possible for me to be here. It's really an honor to be here. I'm grateful to be here to have these conversations with y'all. Up there you'll see 2 QR codes. Even though I'm Gen X, you see how good I am. It took me a while. But one is an accessibility copy, which is the written version of my comments, if it's helpful to you to read along while I speak. And the other is a campaign they're calling Save Gaza Queers. It's designed by Palestinian queer folk who either are in the 48, so in Israel, or are in Gaza, or are from Gaza. So this comes from one of my dearest friends, Khadir Shaifi. And so if you have $5 or $2 or $500 or whatever, go ahead and donate there. I'll show it up again at the end if you feel inspired. But I think it's important right now in this moment for us to just be very clear that scholarship is not an objective practice. It's a platform. When we get a platform, we should use it. And even with our politics, or maybe because of our politics, we can do really the best work possible. So I'm not coming here as an objective observer or commentator. So, yeah, all right. So I'm in rhetoric. You heard some of the rhetoric scholars earlier. So I prepare a manuscript, but I will read it in a very energetic way. I'm going to keep you entertained, I swear. And you can let me know if that's true at the end. So I have about 25 minutes worth of comments, and then I think what we're going to do is get into some groups to sort of discuss together the provocations that I hope the talk raises for you, and then maybe come back together and you can ask me some questions if you like, or we can figure it out. So that's kind of what our plan is, I think. So in October 2003, just 6 weeks after the death of the legendary Palestinian scholar Edward Said, 6 months into the US war in Iraq, and almost 20 years exactly before the Hamas attacks on Israel that were met with the most intense Israeli bombardment of Palestine in the contemporary era. Then American Studies Association president, the late Amy Kaplan, addressed the association with a talk entitled Violent Belongings and the Question of Empire Today. Kaplan provides a dizzying and searing diagnosis of U.S. empire. The subtle and overt ways it manifests was supported by both neoconservatives and liberal interventionists alike, and the stakes for scholars of American studies, and I would add ethnic and racial studies, who hope to intervene in the logic and inner workings of empire with our scholarship and related activism. Just over 20 years later, if you read Kaplan's address, which was published in the journal American Quarterly, you might find yourself, as I did, upon rereading, wondering how so much of what she says remains so utterly salient today. Of course, no surprise is actually warranted for anyone paying attention to the way that the war in Iraq, premised as it was on false pretenses and with support from liberals and conservatives alike, has set the 21st century stage for the ways that the so-called war on terror would come to constitute so much for the way we can't help but understand politics, from the Mexico-US border to Palestine and the Middle East and beyond. Now, using the dire situation in Guantanamo, where more than 700 people, some as young as 15, were held in the name of US national security during the war on terror, and where, as of December 2023, 30 people remain, Kaplan reminds us that in Guantanamo, contemporary empire building in the Middle East meets the history of imperialism in the Americas, pointing to an ominous transnational future. This insight is relevant for us today. But before I get there, I want to make sure that we all have a working understanding of what we mean when we say US empire. I don't assume that everybody necessarily understands that, and I only have a few minutes to speak to you, so I'm not going to be able to articulate all the contours of a thing called US empire, and so I ask that you permit me to paint some broad brush strokes. So the concept of American or US empire generally refers to the ways that the US maintains political, cultural, economic, and military influence beyond its borders. And it can be found in ideas such as that the US is the quote-unquote policeman of the world, wherein we have both the ability and somehow the right to intervene in world affairs as we see fit to maintain a certain assemblage of self-interested peace. The American version of empire is premised in racism, and as Kaplan puts it, the dynamics by which Arabs and the religion of Islam are becoming racialized through the interplay of templates of US racial codes and colonial Orientalism. It's also premised in American exceptionalism. Kaplan is further instructive here, noting that defenders of American empire, regardless of their political persuasion, take American exceptionalism to new heights, its paradoxical claim to uniqueness and universality at the same time. They share a teleological narrative of inevitability, that America is the apotheosis of history, sort of the apex, right, of history. The embodiment of universal values of human rights, liberalism, and democracy, the indispensable nation, in Madeleine Albright's words. Furthermore, in discussing the way that Homeland Security manifests as a particular project of empire, Kaplan notes, although Homeland Security may strive to protect the domestic nation from foreign threats, it's actually about breaking down the boundaries between inside and outside, about seeing the home in a state of constant emergency, besieged by internal and external threats that are indistinguishable. Thus, the notion of the homeland draws on comforting images of a deeply rooted past to legitimate modern forms of imperial power. And for these reasons, resistance to American empire means irrational opposition to modernity and universal human values. So, I hope this helps us a little bit to get on the same page for generally what empire means. So, I come to you today to talk about how I've been thinking about American empire as it manifests at the intersections of anti-Arab, particularly anti-Palestinian sentiment, and some of the recent crackdowns on the Mexico-US border, and of course anyone trying to penetrate the border from the south. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that in the mid-2000s, those on the right wing, such as former US Congressman Tom Tancredo, regularly used the war on terror as justification for further militarization of our southern border. That logic continues into the present day, even as its configurations have changed, but it remains unevenly applied to racialized migrants. One only needs to think, of course, of the disparate ways Ukrainian migrants trying to find their way to the US through Mexico were treated, vis-a-vis the thousands of Haitian and Central American migrants were treated in recent memory. But I have in mind here also taking the way that the common sense logic of empire manifests and how racialized peoples are treated when they resist empire in locations deemed border zones, in the ever-expanding US-Mexico border zone and in Palestine, particularly when that resistance is non-lethal. It could play out the same way when it is lethal, just so you know. It's just kind of doing an exercise here. But so, also again, just to clarify, make sure we're on the same page. When I say I'm interested in the logic of empire, I'm talking about a structure of thinking that thereby structures expression and action. And when it comes to empire, I think its logic, its structure of thinking, has become common sense. And so when we talk about, too far, there we go. When we talk about common sense, Antonio Gramsci defines it as beliefs that people arrive at, not through their own thinking exactly, but because certain ideas are presented as timeless, self-evident truths. We might also think of common sense as like an internal sense, natural, ordinary, rational, practical, concerned with the everyday, reflective of sagacity or the capacity for good judgment, right? We hear common sense thrown about in these ways, right? So I want to also note that when we think of common sense, we also must think of the commons, the public, right? Taken for granted when it comes to evaluating judgment. In the touchstones I'm going to discuss below, the rock thrown by the oppressed in the militarized border zone becomes an important common sense alibi for lethal violence or for the promotion of other forms of non-lethal annihilation. The rock, a weapon of the structurally weak, is no deadly threat compared to, say, a gun or a tank, but in the logic of empire, it can and often does become the grounds for the common sense action of state-sanctioned murder. Here I'm going to offer two seemingly disparate touchstones for our conversation that I hope can begin to illustrate the logic of US empire and offer us ways to think about orienting our interventions. So that's what I hope you'll think about as I'm talking, is like, how do we intervene in this? Like, what does this look like for us as scholars, for us as organizers and activists? All right, so touchstone number one. On November 1st, 2018, as several caravans of migrants made the dangerous journey through Central America and Mexico toward the United States to flee climate change, homophobia, transphobia, poverty, and other political and social violences after decades of imperial meddling by countries like the United States, Donald Trump, sorry to mention his name, gave an address on immigration and border security. Like most of his speeches on the topic, this one rambled on about the drugs and the violence these hordes of quote-unquote illegal aliens brought with them in their attempts to penetrate our sacred national body. After his speech and in response to a reporter's question about whether the military that Trump had called to quote-unquote protect the border would be firing on these people, Trump replied, it's worth just going to put his early words there up for you. I hope not. I hope there won't be, but anybody throwing stones, rocks, like they did to the Mexican military, police, and soldiers of Mexico, we will consider that a firearm. Because there's not much difference when you get hit in the face with a rock. As you know, it was very violent a few days ago. Very, very violent. It was a break-in. It was a break into the country. They broke into Mexico. Now, the migrant caravans in 2018 were largely peaceful, but Trump, I think what he was probably referring to was an October 28th incident when one caravan clashed with police along the Mexico-Guatemala border, and threw rocks and sticks at them in response. Now, the only reported violence that occurred was the death of one migrant in that conflict, though the cause of the death was unclear, and then there were injuries to several others. Now, Trump repeatedly used the phrase break-in to describe the caravan's movements and confrontations with law enforcement and military to position Mexico and by proxy the United States as homes vulnerable to invasion. Trump went on to lament the weak police and military in Guatemala, Honduras, and Mexico for the failures to keep these people at bay when the U.S. pays them so much to do so, presumably referring to the strong-armed agreement the U.S. made with Mexico to stop migrants at its southern border and to stall those migrants in northern border towns who made it through the country. He later put a finer point on his comments. After another question about whether he really meant that the military should fire on rock throwers. He said, "We will consider that. The maximum we can consider that because they are throwing rocks viciously and violently. You saw that 3 days ago, really hurting the military. We will not put up with that." I don't think he meant that, not. If they want to throw their rocks at our military will fight back. I told them to consider it a rifle. When they throw rocks like they did at the Mexican police and military, I say consider it a rifle. Now, Trump's words echo the words of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who in 2015, as Israel issued new rules for punishing rock throwing, proclaimed, "Rocks and firebombs are lethal weapons. They kill and have killed. Those who try to harm us, we will harm them." It's probably important to pause here on rock throwing's place in popular imaginaries worldwide, which no doubt stem, at least in part, from the biblical story of David and Goliath, in which David, a young boy, a sheep herder, takes down the gigantic and powerful Goliath by slinging a rock into his forehead, knocking him unconscious to the ground so that the boy can kill Goliath with his own sword. The story of David and Goliath is a legendary parable for all triumphs, right, of the weak over the powerful, yet the powerful, as Trump's comments make plain, often use the rarely fatal act of resistance as the rationale for state violence, including the use of firearms. Despite that, the United Nations basic principles on the use of force and firearms by law enforcement insist that law enforcement use firearms against people only against the imminent threat of death or serious injury. Now, as the media firestorm over his comments bubbled, Trump backtracked on his comments, stating he only meant that rock throwers should be arrested, not shot. Nevertheless, by then, the heavily armed Nigerian army had already used his words to justify fatal shootings of Islamic Shiite protesters who threw rocks at them. Right, so we see how this stuff circulates. So there's actually very little substantive scholarly work about the politics of throwing stones, and even fewer in my own discipline of rhetoric and communication. Yet the Defiant Act is regularly a preoccupation of colonial, imperial, and otherwise repressive governments such as the United States, Israel, and India. It's often the subject of media attention, and despite its real and allegoric status as a non-lethal action of youth and the politically weak, it is often used as a common sense rationale for state violence. So in what I hope what I'm talking about today is hopefully will be part of the next book. And I want to discuss several responses to rock throwing in order to begin to theorize the relationships between material rhetoric, defiance, and state violence. So the responses I'm hoping to consider in the book will include what happened when the late Edward Said, a Palestinian and at the time a Columbia University professor, threw a rock from Lebanon towards its border with Israel. I want to look at the discourse surrounding Border Patrol agent Lonnie Swartz's killing of 16-year-old Jose Antonio Elena Rodriguez for allegedly throwing rocks from Nogales at agents on the U.S. side in 2012. And I want to look at the iconic image of Farah Sadeh, a 14-year-old Palestinian boy throwing a rock at an Israeli tank, his subsequent killing by Israeli occupation forces during the Second Intifada, and the ways that Israel has cracked down on stone throwing, including at the 2018 Right of Return marches, and obviously, what's going on right now. So, touchstone number 2. And before I get into it, I want to offer a caveat, which is to say that while the creation of the state of Israel is undeniably a product of British Empire. You know that history, you know, if you don't learn it, please, especially right now. But Israel is not necessarily itself an empire. But the U.S.'s unwavering support for Israel, even today with our president's mealy-mouthed calls for a temporary ceasefire in Gaza, ensure that Israel is allowed to function both as an extension of U.S. empire and due to its elaborate security industry as a leading agency of U.S. empire. That's an argument that requires some teasing out, but I guess I ask you to permit me for a moment how the predominance of U.S. imperial interests in the Middle East enables not only Israel's ongoing occupation of Palestine and violence against Palestinians, but also allows Israel to function as a proxy for U.S. empire itself. Moreover, this quote-unquote special relationship and the logic of empire it engenders also enables U.S. actors to speak as authorities about Israeli and Palestinian affairs, which is in part what this touchstone I'm going to talk about will illustrate. So let's talk about Edward Said. Because what happened to him in 2000 helps to illustrate empire's logic in relation to this non-lethal act of rock throwing in an application that itself is non-lethal, but that has the intent of annihilation, of reputation, of livelihood, of character. So on July 3rd, 2000, the renowned Columbia University professor and Palestinian intellectual, the late Edward Said, was with his family on the southern border of Lebanon that connects it with Israel. In late May of that year, Israeli troops, which had occupied southern Lebanon for 18 years, finally withdrew. Said had not been to the region since 1982, when Israel began its invasion of Lebanon. Now, certainly this must have been a very emotional time for Said. Born in Jerusalem in 1935, and whose family home was annexed in 1948 by Israel, to be standing on land now free from occupation. I mean, it must have been a powerful experience, right? But, of course, that land was still a border zone. And when Israel left, it erected a barbed wire fence, and just on the other side of that wire fence sat an Israeli watchtower. Since the withdrawal, it reportedly had become customary for Arabs to visit the southern border to throw rocks at the fence. For most of the day, Said and his family spent time in the El Khaim prison, where Lebanese resistance fighters had been held in horrible conditions and had been treated terribly. Said spoke to former prisoners about their experiences. Said, whose mother was half Lebanese, undoubtedly connected with their stories and their plight, right? Now, afterwards, he drove to the border village of Kafr Kila, where he joined a crowd of people elated at the lack of Israeli forces, and several who threw rocks toward the barbed wire. In a statement, Said wrote, "For a moment, I joined in. The spirit of the place infected everyone with the same impulse to make a symbolic gesture of joy that the occupation had ended. So he, too, threw a rock toward the fence." That's him there. You know, he's like an elderly man throwing a rock, right? So it's really threatening. As Said put it, one stone tossed into an empty space scarcely warrants a second thought. But perhaps the world's most well-known Palestinian intellectual should have known that even the most benign act of Palestinian resistance will be met with woefully unequal response. As numerous commentators and Palestinians alike have remarked, the stone has become a symbol of the Palestinian struggle against Israeli occupation, violence, and apartheid. It is an act of rageful defiance in the face of overwhelming oppression. To Israel, it is an unequivocally provocative act. For decades, the simple act of hurling a stone has become the unquestioned justification for high-tech Israeli aggression against Palestinians. A French press agency photographer captured Said just before he tossed the rock, and shortly thereafter the firestorm erupted. And I think many of these responses that he received are completely reflective of the logic of U.S. empire. For example, a columnist in the Columbia Student newspaper wrote about Said's rock throwing alongside his meeting with a leader from Hezbollah, which he did. The student says, "It is unfortunate that perhaps our best known professor has chosen to publicly support a known terrorist whose organization is responsible for hundreds of deaths, he can hide behind his reputation no longer. His repugnant terrorist sympathies are exposed. Shame on you, Edward Said. Although Columbia University refused to comment on the outside activities of its faculty and supported Said's right to academic freedom, which, can we pause on that for a moment? How far a cry that is from what's happening at that exact same university today in terms of repression of Palestinians. And if you don't know, look it up, what Columbia University is doing. It's unreal. I don't know any place that it's worse than Columbia. So some months later after this happened, letters poured into the American Association of University Professors publication Academe. So American Association of University Professors, AAUP, it's an organization that supports academic freedom, faculty governance, and tenure. So it's like the biggest national organization of this sort. So these letters, came in lambasting. We're not there yet. One wrote, would Columbia or the AAUP support a racist faculty members throwing a stone through the window of a black newspaper on campus? Another decried, I would be surprised if either Columbia or the AAUP would protect my right to throw rocks at its administration building. There's a difference between free speech and violent acts, although in the case of Edward Said, neither Columbia University nor the AAUP seems to recognize the difference. And still another writer posed, since I am indeed a professor, could I go and throw rocks at Mr. Jonathan Knight, who's AAUP's associate secretary, or the AAUP's distinguished secretary, Mary Bergen? Will the AAUP promise not to press charges if I do so? Now I think each of these comments is interesting in the argument by analogy that they employ, arguments which reflect the logic of American empire. So in argumentation theory, those of you who've had Kennard's classes, and maybe you'll know some of this, right? An argument by analogy is only effective if the two cases being compared are similar enough to make the argument credible. So it's worth parsing for a moment what is being compared here, right? So we must start with our control case. So everything we're going to compare is against the case of Said. So Edward Said is a tenured professor and a Palestinian who threw a rock towards a barbed wire fence on the Lebanese-Israeli border, and Israeli soldiers were on the other side of that border, but neither property nor person, right, was damaged, okay? No one present claimed that Said targeted an individual, and it's unclear whether the rock he threw crossed the border or if it landed on Lebanese soil. All right, so that's our control case. Those are the facts of the case. So now we'll take these in turns. So in the first example, the letter writer asked whether a racist professor throwing a rock through the window of a black newspaper would be treated as Said has been treated. So in this case, Said is compared with a racist professor. A broken window on university property is compared to a barbed wire fence on a national border. And black journalists are the equivalent of armed Israeli soldiers who recently withdrew from Lebanon. In other words, and this is so clearly reflective of the way that empire is premised in racism but denies the significance of race. Right? Said is a racist, a rock landing near a border is the same as crashing through a window, and Israeli soldiers are as oppressed as black journalists in the United States. So I guess this case holds some common sense merit in the imperialist imaginary of the United States, where Palestinians and critics of Israel are frequently framed as racists or anti-Semites, and Israelis, though maybe not necessarily soldiers, are often positioned as an oppressed group vis-a-vis critics of the state of Israel and the rest of the Middle East. All right, you can make your own determinations there. In case two, so case two is a white male emeritus professor, meaning a retired professor of physics at a public research university. And he asked whether Columbia and the AAUP would defend him for throwing rocks at either's administration building. Now, in this case, again, reflecting the denial of the significance of race, the white male professor is Said. The administration building is the national border, and the AAUP in Columbia are apparently the Israeli soldiers. So unlike the last case, this one offers no analysis at all of differing power dynamics or politics. But it is telling of Kaplan's point that the manifestation of American empire and homeland security is, quote, about breaking down the boundaries between inside and outside, about seeing the home in a state of constant emergency, besieged by internal and external threats that are indistinguishable. So the admin building is no different from the Israeli-Lebanon border in this argument, and both are potentially in a state of emergency. So you see this kind of blurring of these logics. Now, in the third case, right, represented there, the author, a math and computer science professor, asks whether he can throw rocks directly at two employees of the AAUP without repercussion. In this case, the math professor is Said. The rock thrown at the national border is a rock thrown at the bodies of two organizational leaders. And the two leaders, I guess, are the Israeli soldiers. As in the previous case, the analogy holds no credibility without an analysis of power and politics. A further blending of internal and external threats persists, and U.S. entities are stand-ins for the Israeli military, almost suggesting overtly that they are one and the same. And so we're seeing a lot of this blurring here in the way these arguments get made. So, why is it so important to spend so much time parsing the logic and assumptions of each of these arguments by analogy? I think these pithy examples have much to tell us about how Palestinians, and by extension other colonized peoples, are viewed. They have equally as much to suggest to us about predominant theories of violence and the logic of American empire. Moreover, they seem to suggest that within the logic of American empire, the emotions of the structurally powerful are equal to those of the structurally oppressed. Now, it may seem strange, the turn that I'm about to make, but I want to conclude by bringing our analysis to another brief touchstone, which is outside of border zones, but targets the resistance of the structurally weak. The logic identified here is the same common sense logic of empire that has led to the bans on DEI, CRT, and Black Studies, which are all at least purportedly catalyzed by the bad feelings of conservative white students who are angry because they feel silenced, censored, and otherwise threatened by education that deals with power, history, and cultural difference. As Kaplan again expressed 2 decades ago, American empire is constituted by the interplay of templates of US racial codes and colonial Orientalism. Resistance from the racial and colonial other is always a threat to empire. We are here together in Texas. We're in the bans on so-called DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, and the repression of those expressing solidarity with Palestinian liberation converge in startling ways. So many of you have heard about this, but Texas Tech assistant professor Jairo Funes Flores, an education scholar with expertise in colonial theory, has recently been suspended with pay by his institution due to Tech's interpretation of his First Amendment protected tweets on Palestine as anti-Semitic. I would add that his position as a faculty member of color who publicly commented, who dared to publicly comment, has made him additionally vulnerable in light of Texas SB 17. So for those of you not from Texas, SB 17 in part purportedly bans diversity training in Texas public colleges and universities, but it has been interpreted by university legal offices to incorporate a wide swath of public discussion on the banned training categories of race, ethnicity, color, gender, and sexuality. Such discussions, I think, are understood as striking a blow to the myths of American exceptionalism and meritocracy. So, by the logic of empire, they must be annihilated. In the logic of empire, which I also believe is the same logic informing the Supreme Court anti-affirmative action decision, Florida's decision to ban Black Studies, and that which allows Said to be conflated with privileged white people, and Israeli soldiers to be the same as Black journalists. All violence and expression of resistance, regardless of the actor within this logic, can be characterized as strategically equivalent for the purpose of maintaining empire. So it's kind of flattening. When you understand the structure of thinking, however problematic it is easier to see why Israel, quote unquote, has a right to self-defense, even though they're an occupying force. Or the US has the right to protect its southern border. And the state of Texas has the right to censor the speech of racial minorities in its employ. All of these actions keep, quote unquote, the peace, wherein the peace is the dominance of American exceptionalism, its investment in benign, quote unquote, paternalism, and its privileging of colorblind equality. And I think, I hope, with that last touchstone, that we can see how looking at rock throwing in border zones provides a kind of window to understand this logic and its multiple manifestations. And my sincere hope is that in our understanding, we may better resist. So I'm gonna leave it there. Let's give it back to you.
Excuse me. Thank you, Dr. Chavez. We're going to take this moment now to kind of be in conversation with people at our tables. And so what we want everyone to consider are, some of the points that Dr. Chavez just made about, we're thinking through how colonized life is devalued and flattened. Right? How do we contest that in terms of, there's a great commentator that I'm forgetting his name now, mentioned how the exchange rate between Israeli life and Palestinian life is totally out of whack, right? For one Israeli that is killed, you have 100, if not 1,000 people that Palestinians who must die in order to justify that. And we see that even in the case of Trump mentioning, this one rock thrower that, threw this rock, now we can justify, the mass murder of migrants at the border. And so maybe one question for people to consider during this time is how do we intervene with that, or how do we find ways to breathe life back into life that is devalued. On top of that, maybe one thing we can also consider is what modes of resistance we can imagine. So rock throwing, right, is one has multiple meanings for people who use that as a mode of resistance. But what might be some other modes of resistance that we can imagine, especially given this context of the devaluation of colonized life? And maybe the last thing to also consider is how we can intervene as scholars, as activists in this university setting, given that as Dr. Chavez mentioned, so many universities like Columbia have worked to silence Palestinian voices and the voices of the colonized for decades. So we're going to take this time. You can take any of these questions or new questions that you want to discuss amongst yourselves. And then we can also open it up afterward. And if you have any questions for Dr. Chavez, we can turn to that as well. So again, feel free to introduce yourself to your neighbor if you haven't had a chance to do that. I know many of us have now spent almost 12 hours together, so maybe we don't have to do that. But just take a few moments to talk amongst yourselves, and we'll come back as a group to consider some of the questions.
And told you what to put. And so I imagine along those lines, right? Yeah, he was 2 years ago. Oh, he did? Oh, okay. Okay. these little, I think it's here.
Yeah, no, when professors were there, I was just like, I don't know, like your whole sentence didn't make any sense. Like it just completely over. But I really loved the project. That was really good.
It was good.
Yeah, it was so interesting. Yeah. I'm afraid for a little bit. I'm supposed to work, but I think I might be able to sleep that one. At least in Oh, yeah, yeah. Yes, I'll try my best. Bye, thank you.
I was thinking, yeah, it needs to be our wetland. If I have time, I'll do that someday. Maybe when I'm dead. Like Orlando.
We'll take about 5 more minutes, so you can sort of get to a nice conclusion of your talk, and then we'll come back together.
think there's a lot of people.
And then I'm also like surprised when they like people asking me if I knew like what the game was, if I was an athlete, things of that nature. Even till this day, when I work then like oh, like you're just so tall.
Is that what you're saying? I think she's doing
Hello again, everyone. Sorry to interrupt your conversations, but I did want to, take this moment to kind of get us back in terms of our group conversation. And so now I guess we'll pass over the mic to you all in terms of, if there's any thoughts or reflections that you'd like to share with the group, and also any questions that you'd like to pose for Dr. Chavez. We'll take this opportunity to do so. So someone get started with raising their hand, we can do it that way. Ruben?
Okay, first of all, thank you. That was amazing. I have some thoughts and it's not just some thoughts, it's a question. And okay, so I want to preface, you don't, given what's going on with professor, all the things, you don't have to answer this, or we can talk about it later anyway. But I'm just thinking, so in the title, and you mentioned this a few times in the talk, it was politically weak and structurally weak, and I see what that means and what that's doing. But I'm wondering what happens when and I think this designation, still holds true when this happens, the thing that I'm about to say. But I think the perception of it changes under imperialist logics. And so that's kind of where I'm thinking. What happens when the rock turns into a gun? What happens when colonized people do take up armed struggle, which is an internationally enshrined right? Although we also have seen the imperialist theater that international law is. So yeah, with the argument theory and the rhetoric part of it, I'm just wondering what happens, because I think it still holds true, right? That the imperialist structures are still on the oppressing side, but I think the perception of it changes under imperialist logics to justify genocide, right? So in the context of the argument theory, I'm just curious about that, what happens when that happens.
Yeah, so on your first point, even the title, so I've been playing with James C. Scott's idea of weapons of the weak and trying to sort of expand out that theory a little bit. So Scott's idea of the weapons of the weak is he's interested in how those who are structurally weak, meaning they don't have access to formal mechanisms of power, the ways that they engage in acts of resistance that those who are in power may not necessarily recognize as such. So whether that's, foot dragging or, just whisper networks. I mean, there's all sorts of things, right, that we all know. Many of us probably do them ourselves, right, at work. So, and I'm thinking about, does weapons of the week have to be that kind of more imperceptible stuff, or can it be these other things that are literally like, I throw a rock, it is not the same as a gun. So that's where that, and I'm not sure if I'm going to use Scott now, but that's still kind of, I was thinking that when I turned my title in, so that's kind of lingering there and still in the talk. Another thing I have been thinking about is, what are these gradations of actions of the oppressed, right? So, because we know that you can do nothing at all and you can be murdered by the state. You can resist with your voice and you can be murdered by the state. You can throw a rock and be murdered by the state. You can shoot a gun and be murdered by the state. You can drop a bomb and be murdered by the state, right? So all of these actions, right, may result in the exact same thing. So I'm interested, though, in this kind of middle zone, because I do think that, and I may end up being wrong once I get really into this project more, but I think there's something there about, that reveals a little bit about the way the state, especially the sort of empire, thinks about the oppressed. And I don't quite know what that is yet, but I think there's something there. So that's the hunch that I'm going on for this research project, I guess is a short way I'll answer your question. Thank you for the question. And again, you don't have to ask questions. You can just comment. That's this kind of Q&A, so it's a beautiful thing.
When you were talking about how there's a sort of like a middle point or turning point in how the empire thinks about the oppressed, are you talking about what they deem as acceptable, or kind of like what switches the flip from off to on, or what were you trying to locate, that thing that you can't name yet?
Yeah, see, I can't name it, so I do think, and I don't know exactly what it is, right? I think, well, so if you think about what's happening right now in Gaza, one of the things that's very hard for liberals to wrap their head around is how you can be in support of the people of Gaza without also condemning Hamas. Right? So even though the occupied have the right to resist by any means necessary, that it's just, I mean, you see it in your own lives, I'm sure. Maybe some of you find yourself up against this wall where like, I have to condemn Hamas, or it's a non-starter to talk about Palestinian land. So that's on the extreme end, right? What Hamas does is kind of on the extreme end. I think I'm interested in sort of that breaking point. So if someone has, I mean, it's hard though, and I don't know where it is, because you could also say, for example, like not in a border zone, but take the case of Freddie Gray. So you remember Freddie Gray in 2015, right? So he's this like 25-year-old, 140-pound young black man with asthma, and he has a knife in his pocket. I actually have a knife in my pocket right now, right? Many of us might have a knife in our purse or our pocket right now. And he gets pulled over, he ends up in a police van, and he leaves dead, right? That knife in his pocket was such a threat because of anti-blackness, right? So that line is different, I think, depending on the context. But part of my interest in this project is simply that there is a preoccupation with the act of rock throwing. And I'm interested in that preoccupation with that particular act of rock throwing because you can find it all over the world. It's also got historical relevance at many places all over the world. And there's even some like evolutionary anthropologists that talk about rock throwing as one of the actions, the evolutionary actions that defines what it means to be human. So there's all these different pieces to this thing that I think make that particular action interesting. And I also think it may be somewhere on this kind of scale, but I don't know if that hypothesis is going to end up holding when I really play out the taxonomy. Sorry, that was a really long rambling answer. I'd love to talk to you about it though.
I wanted to uplift something that Ms. Shirley had expressed about whenever we're talking about resistance and how we could continue doing that. One point that they had brought up was using or subverting or manipulating the algorithm, because that is a new frontier of technology that we cannot see the end of. So this means by uplifting, commenting, rewording, and all of these different mechanisms to spread the information through the platforms in which we're given, and we use it so often. And I think that's how I became so informed myself, and hold gratitude for community that I do not know personally, but still share, love and solidarity with. And then also a point that Gloria had brought up into kind of like embracing the trolling, because what was it, like a real estate sale, something shitty that Israeli settlers are auctioning off land, and so somebody had use their platform to kind of share a way to log on and fill out a bunch of entries, and they posted like the entire script to the B movie on there, and like just different things like that. But it kind of rooted me back into like resistance could look silly, and resistance could look authentically yourself. In such rigid systems that we're occupying every day, or occupies us, to allow ourselves to be authentic and just, weird. Yeah.
Oh my God, I love that so much.
So I guess the question that I would have is that I am somebody that does involve myself in political organizations, and I know we've mentioned that throughout this conversation. My question is, when it comes to this next voting season, because it's hectic, like I'm sitting here doing endorsements and everything, what frame of thinking do you think people should put into when they go into a voter's box this next year? As far as things going with Gaza, things going on with the economy, like where should we fall as far as, not making a decision, but like what line of thinking should be put through people's minds? Because I know I want, but I don't know about everybody else should go.
Well, what logic are you using? If you're willing to share.
Humanity. I believe in humanity. I believe in human right. And I don't think, personally for me, I don't feel comfortable voting for somebody who's willing to hurt innocents, and I don't feel comfortable with someone who's willing to who's willing to just hurt people with no regard, basically.
Yeah, I'd love to hear others weigh in on that. I mean, I can say, I don't know what the fucking answer is. Sorry. Okay, the kids I mean, I think, I voted for the first time in 1996. And, I had a very undeveloped political analysis. So, I was very excited to vote for Bill Clinton. What can you do? But, since Clinton, probably since before, the Democrats, I think, continue to put those of us who are on the left or center left or far left in a deeply unsustainable situation. And it's also a two-party system, right? But I mean, what do you do? So, I mean, do you not vote for Joe Biden because he's basically as bad as Trump, but not quite as bad as Trump? And then Trump gets to be president again? Or do you stick to your principles and you just, you know, do it because Trump's, is voting just harm reduction? Can we vote our principles? If you vote your principles for a third-party candidate, I don't know. I mean, this is our dilemma, and we've been in the same dilemma for 30 years. So I'm old, so it's your generation. That's what old people say. It's your generation. We gotta fix this problem for us. So I'm looking forward to that in my retirement. Thank you. But I'd love to hear other people. What are you doing this fall? How are you making this decision? What's that look like? Or other, if there's other folks over there, then go ahead.
Well, you have to take into account that this is an international situation. It's not always say sometimes to make that stand. I mean, word this. I've been getting a lot of international opinions because I got tired of talking to my neighbors, and also I work with a lot of people from international places, but getting their opinions is actually very helpful, considering that the U.S., with all the connotations that it has, is still perceived as a world police. And in the end of the day, even though we're not affected, everyone else outside of the U.S. is definitely affected. So getting the outside perspective is very, very important, because the U.S. doesn't just affect us, it affects every single person in the entire globe. So how am I don't have an answer of who I'm voting for yet, but I will say I have an answer on who to ask. And that has to do with people outside of the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, that's empire, right? The U.S. touches every corner of the earth.
Hello. My question is one of resistance within the Imperial Core, mostly focused on disrupting the military-industrial complex. So how can we as students disrupt Lockheed Martin, who will be having an event on TCU campus, Raytheon, EBT Systems, and how are we supposed to, or can we, sever that relationship with academic institutions, looking at UTA and UTD as a model, referencing the recent UTD protest disrupting Lockheed Martin in their presentation?
Well, I think that's part of the answer, right? I think, a couple of things. One, and there's this really interesting dilemma for students of your generation that's different even from mine, and is especially different from like the glory days of the 1960s and 70s of student protests, which is that, in the 1960s, if your tuition was $25, basically for one class, right? So maybe $10 credit or something. And so your whole year was going to cost you $300 for tuition. You can take 8 or 9 years to finish your undergrad degree and drop out a few semesters because you were going to fail out or your organizing took up too much time. And in the end, it wasn't going to cost you that much. And also, universities weren't quite as punitive in the sense of like that if you got kicked out, you couldn't get back in. But now, I don't know what the semesterly tuition is at a place like TCU, I imagine.
84,000.
How much?
84,000.
54,000?
84.
$84,000.
More than Harvard.
Wow. I hope it's worth it. So a place like $84,000. Now most people come here probably are not paying that out of pocket. There's I'm sure a lot of financial aid, whatever. But nonetheless, there's a huge risk for you as a student to risk getting kicked out.
Yes.
If you waste that semester, like that's like double what my dad's income was growing up. So there's this whole other layer of pressures on you because of increased costs of higher education. And then there is the fact that I do believe universities, at least in my experience, I started college in 1986, to the present, like they are much more punitive spaces than I think they once were. UT is definitely that way right now. So there's this greater risk, and so I give that long preamble to say I understand the risks that students face in engaging in acts of disruption and protest. Nevertheless, I do think that as long as you're doing it in well-disciplined, strong, and diverse coalitions where lots of people are going to be implicated, I think student disruptions of these kinds of activities is very, very important, even if only for the spectacle that it produces. It's also very important to have trusted media contacts who will be there to document that for you. It's also very important you have clear talking points when you do something like that. It's also very important to go on the offensive, meaning writing your own op-eds, doing your own media interviews, maybe even producing your own media that others will circulate, whether that's TikTok or YouTube or other platforms, right? So you can't just go in without a very clear plan. You also probably should get in touch with lawyers before you do stuff like this. You can tell I work a lot with student organizers. And then the other piece of that is divestment. And so whether that is just divestment in general from fossil fuels, from companies you name, like those that are connected to the military-industrial complex. You can focus specifically on divestment in relation to Israel, right? But again, being very, very principled, knowing who your allies are, going through the process. UT is about to embark on a divestment process campaign now. So I still think those are the two best bets, but I recognize the risks are a lot different right now.
I'm going to try to be brief because I am very tired, but just on the issue.
Why? 8 hours or 12 hours?
But on the issue of voting, I think one way to think about it in terms of instead of thinking of how am I going to make this existential feeling decision in November, I think one thing I'm seeing is that so much of the political power is happening right now, right? This is the moment where politics can be shifted, right? Definitely don't wait till November. For example, Michelle Vallejo on the border sort of campaigned as kind of like the more progressive, one of the first sort of more progressive Rio Grande Valley politicians that seem to have a chance to win. She's running again. There's a group down there on GV, the Food Not Bombs group, that has been very much putting pressure on her because she took money from Israeli lobby groups, right? And so that's being felt. The voting uncommitted, that's being felt. So it's kind of like the voting is kind of not necessarily a thing that shifts everything, especially after the election. It's even harder to move politicians once they're in office. So the moment is now, definitely. And I don't think it has to be a super existential thing. Who am I going to vote for? Knowing that voting has its place, but it isn't everything. So keep organizing.
Amen to that. I mean, my friend Jesus Valles is a poet, and he always says, "All we have is us." And that is what we have. Is all we have is us. So, this is a dilemma of the political system, of the political in the proper sense, but it's about our networks, it's about our own political education, coalitions with each other, organizing our communities, doing the difficult work we don't want to do. And, I don't know, we can't not deal with that realm, but to me it's never been my focus.
One thing that I've been trying to make sense of or reason with is knowing that the institutions that are in place are not meant to work for us, especially if we're marginalized or oppressed. And I personally believe that they have to be dismantled and eradicated, but I know that's not going to happen by next week. So how are we able to move towards a future in which we don't have these systems, in which they are gone while still existing in a lifetime or in the moment in which they are still very real and very influential in our day-to-day lives?
So, I mean, this is what abolition is all about, right? And I have many abolitionist mentors in my life, but probably the biggest one for me is Mariam Kaba. And so if you don't know Mariam Kaba's work, I want to encourage you to find everything you can from her and read it. She keeps a Substack or one of these, I think it's called U.S. Prison Culture. She's authored several books. There's
We actually are giving away a free copy of Let Us Radicalize You.
Really?
It's in the conference bag, so some of you have copies of Let This Radicalize You.
So we didn't even plan this. This just happened. Man,
Yeah.
Stacey. But yeah, you know, and the reason I love her is one, she's the one, the phrase, you know, hope is a discipline. That's her phrase, hope is a discipline. You can't just hope, it's a discipline. You've got to practice putting that in action all the time. And what that looks like for her is she is constantly building, she's prefiguring the world she wants in the present. So she's not utopian, and that's really important to know about abolitionist politics, is it's not utopian. It's very practical. It is about building right now what you want for the future. So if you want a world without prisons, which I do, how do you engage in non-punitive practices in the present, right? How do you build deeper alternative structures of justice in the present with your friends, right? With your family, right? You can't say you're an abolitionist and then you're icing out like your brother, right? Now maybe you can if like that there's no way to repair that harm or something, or or you're not ready yet, but like you have to be living it all the time. The philosopher Maria Lugones, the late Maria Lugones, she used to say, I won't think what I can't practice. So she was very anti-utopian. She thought utopian politics would, because utopia by definition doesn't exist. So she was very invested in creativity, you know, folks in the back there, being silly, playful, whatever it was, but doing it here. And I think that's the commitment for all of us. Do it right here. Practice it now. Maybe not be big enough to fill this room yet, but maybe it will be.
Thank you so much for being here tonight. I really admire your work, and what you just gave us tonight was very, very powerful. I just want to know, how are you, and how are you taking care of yourself, and is there anything that we can do to support your work and what you're doing at your own institution?
What a sweet question. I mean, I think we're all supporting each other, I hope. I was saying to Louise, I'm a big gardener. So I really believe in getting your hands in the dirt, growing tiny little seeds into baby little plants, into fruit-producing monsters. So I'm a huge believer in this. So I spend a lot of time in the soil with plants. And you know, that's also a sustainability practice, right? I'm a bit of a prepper. So I like to learn all these things. So I do a lot of that, but you know, I think the community keeps all of us uplifted if we're constantly checking in with each other, and if you're not checking in with your people regularly, like do so. If you're not doing gentle, sweet things for your friends and loved ones, we all just gotta do that for each other. And I think, you know, returning to play, I'm like a really silly person. I mean, people always are like, you're such a hard-ass bitch. And I'm like, yes, I am, but I'm also like a big goofball, and I think we have to, whatever your inner goofball is, nurture them. It's really important. So I try to do that, you know, and I talk a lot of shit. Thank you for that sweet question.
Yeah, I love plants and growing things too.
Hey, let's talk later about what we're growing.
We have time for like one more question.
Everyone's like, let me go home.
I know. Well, I kind of wanted to just address the question that we discussed at the table, because I was a bit at a loss.
I would say thinking about how to break through some of the, and I was just curious if people could share either in their groups what came up, because you know, one of the things we were talking about is preserving memory and making sure we're documenting the work that's happening, because that's one way to shift the narrative historically, or to make sure that the people who are often lost to those, you know, records get honored and named. But that felt all very incomplete as a intervention. So I guess if we wanted to maybe share some things that came up.
So this isn't something we talked about, but it's something I'm thinking about. I think the practice of naming and uplifting, like those who are lost to the records, right, is important, but I think what's more important is the action.
Yes.
And like everyone has been saying, like the action of the here and now, like that comes with, like, it's not just about naming them, right? It's about acting in a way that intervenes in the systems that did that to them. So, I mean, I think about someone like Aaron Bushnell, who self-immolated, and I think, you know, there's been vigils, right, and there's been all these things, and I think, from my perspective, what I think is also what he would have wanted, because he was also an anarchist, like I think he would have wanted action along with the vigils, and we're seeing that in a lot of different places, by a lot of different comrades and different orgs. And action doesn't have to mean that. It can also mean the silly, the goofy, right? It's all the different types of action. Yeah.
Anybody else?
We're all still thinking about it. Well, let's go ahead and give Dr. Chavez an